It was a typical Friday evening, and I decided to treat myself to a quiet dinner in my favorite Italian restaurant, a small, intimate place on the corner of Elm Street. I hadn't been there in years, not since Susan and I used to go. It was strange how the heart pulled you to familiar places, even when the memories were sharp enough to cut. I was halfway through my meal when I saw her. Susan, my ex-wife, walked in on the arm of a man who oozed wealth and confidence. Designer suit, gold watch, the kind of guy who never glanced at a menu before ordering. I froze mid-bite as a rush of emotions surged through me: anger, sadness, confusion, and something I didn't want to admit: longing. It had been 3 years since the divorce, but the wounds still felt fresh. Seeing her now, radiant and laughing at his jokes, was like reopening an old scar. I wondered, did she ever look at me like that? Was this man her upgrade, her prize after tearing apart our life together? The memories came flooding back. Our wedding day, the promises we made, the way she used to hold my hand during storms because she hated thunder. But they were quickly overshadowed by darker recollections. Her late-night work meetings, the missed calls, the growing distance. And then, of course, the betrayal that shattered it all. Sitting there, I couldn't help but reflect on the person I had been back then. Naive, trusting, and maybe too wrapped up in my own world to see the cracks forming in our marriage. I wasn't blameless. I knew that, but what Susan did to me went beyond normal marital issues. I paid for my meal, left a generous tip, and walked out without saying a word to her. I didn't need to. The weight of that brief encounter was enough to drag me down for the rest of the evening. On the drive home, I couldn't stop replaying the past in my head, wondering what signs I had missed, what I could have done differently. But deep down, I knew the truth. It wasn't just about what I missed. It was about what she chose to do. That night, as I stared at the ceiling, I decided it was time to confront those memories, to finally piece together everything that had led to our downfall. This wasn't just her story, it was mine too. It happened on a Thursday. I wasn't supposed to be home. My company had sent me out of town for a conference, but a last-minute cancellation meant I could return 2 days early. I didn't bother calling Susan to let her know. I thought it would be a nice surprise. As I pulled into the driveway, something felt off. Her car was there, but the house was unusually quiet. No TV, no music. Even the lights were dim. I grabbed my suitcase, walked to the door, and paused for a moment, debating whether to knock for fun or just walk in. I didn't get the chance to decide. From the living room window, I caught a glimpse of movement, shadows, shapes. It wasn't just Susan. There were multiple people inside, laughing, talking in hushed voices. My stomach dropped. I entered quietly, the kind of quiet you muster when your instincts scream something is wrong. As I moved closer to the living room, the sounds became clearer: Susan's voice and the voices of men I didn't recognize. My heart raced. What I saw next made me wish I'd stayed at the conference. There she was, my wife, tangled up with her boss, Jeff Davis, and 2 other men I didn't know. It wasn't just a casual interaction. It was a full-blown scene of betrayal, shameless and horrifying. I froze, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. The woman I had loved and trusted, the person I had vowed to spend my life with, was laughing and engaging with these men in ways I never thought possible. I don't remember how long I stood there. Seconds? Minutes? It felt like an eternity. My heart was pounding, my hands trembling, but I didn't storm in. Instead, I pulled out my phone and recorded everything. Every sound, every detail. I knew I'd need proof. When I finally stepped back outside, I sat in my car for what felt like hours, staring at the house that was no longer my home. The betrayal wasn't just physical. It was emotional, a complete disregard for everything we had built together. Driving away that night, I wasn't sure what hurt more, the act itself or the realization that the person I thought I knew was capable of this. The drive back to the house the next morning felt like walking into a war zone. My emotions churned between fury and heartbreak, but amidst the chaos, one thing was clear. I wasn't going to let Susan, or the others, walk away from this unscathed. When I pulled into the driveway, I noticed the cars of the men still parked out front. That sight alone made my blood boil. They had no shame, No regard for me or the sanctity of my home. I clenched the tire iron I kept in the trunk, but instead of smashing windows, I did something more calculated. I crouched by each car and deflated their tires. Every last one of them. It wasn't destruction, but it was enough to inconvenience them and buy me time. With that done, I stepped into the house. Susan was in the kitchen, wrapped in a robe, holding a mug of coffee like it was just another normal morning. When she saw me, her face paled, and the mug slipped from her hands, shattering on the tile floor. You're supposed to be out of town," she stammered, her voice trembling. I replied, my voice cold and even. "But I came home early. Guess what I saw last night?" She didn't answer. She didn't have to. Her silence, the way her eyes darted around the room like she was searching for an escape, said everything. "I'm going upstairs," I continued. "You're not coming with me. Pack your things and get out. Now!" Her protest started almost immediately. "Wait, we need to talk. It's not what you think." "It's exactly what I think," I snapped, cutting her off. "You brought them into our house, Susan. Don't insult me by pretending there's an explanation for this." As she stumbled over excuses, I marched upstairs. The bedroom smelled faintly of cologne that wasn't mine. It made me nauseous, but I pushed through, gathering anything of hers I could find and throwing it into a bag. Back downstairs, I handed her the bag and said, "You have 2 hours. After that, the locks will be changed, and if you're still here, I'll call the cops." For a moment, I thought she might argue, but she didn't. She just nodded, tears streaming down her face, and started packing. By the time I was alone in the house again, I felt a strange mix of relief and rage. I knew this was just the beginning, that there was still so much to confront, so much to deal with. But for now, the space was mine again. I grabbed my laptop, opened the recordings I'd taken, and sent a message to the one person I trusted completely, my lawyer and old friend, Ted. By the time I met with Ted, I had replayed the recordings so many times that every sound, every word, was burned into my memory. I wasn't just angry, I was determined. If Susan thought she could destroy everything we'd built together and walk away unscathed, she was sorely mistaken. Ted had been my friend since college, and I trusted him with more than just legal matters. When I handed him the files, videos, photos, and messages I had gathered, he raised an eyebrow, but didn't say a word. Instead, he plugged in his laptop and started reviewing everything in silence. When he finally spoke, his tone was sharp and professional. "This is damning, no doubt about it. But we need to play this smart. If we come at her too aggressively, it could backfire in court. What exactly do you want out of this?" I leaned back in my chair, trying to focus through the storm of emotions. "I want to make sure she doesn't get away with this. She disrespected our marriage, our home, everything. I want the divorce, but I also want to make sure I don't lose the house or get stuck paying her anything." Ted nodded. "Fair. But it's not just about the divorce. Her boss being involved and the other men complicates things. This could hurt her career, and if we handle it right, we can use that to our advantage." "What are you suggesting?" I asked, curious but cautious. "First, we confront her employers. If her boss was involved, the company could face legal repercussions. We use that as leverage to negotiate a settlement. Second, we make sure you keep control of your assets. No spousal support, no child support if you have kids. This evidence will be our ace in the hole." It was ruthless, but it was exactly what I needed to hear. Ted's confidence made me feel like I had some semblance of control again. Over the next week, we worked tirelessly to organize everything. Emails, text messages, financial records, and of course, the recordings. Ted drafted a plan that was as strategic as it was bulletproof. He would schedule a meeting with Susan's employers to present the evidence, not as a threat, but as a clear warning of what could happen if they didn't cooperate. Every step of the process felt like a small victory. I wasn't just reacting anymore, I was taking action. And for the first time since discovering her betrayal, I felt like I was regaining my sense of self. The final piece was confronting Susan herself. Ted insisted we wait until after we'd met with her employers to serve her the divorce papers. "Let's hit her from all sides," he said. "She won't see it coming." And honestly, I liked the sound of that. The meeting was scheduled for a Thursday afternoon in a sleek downtown office. Ted had arranged everything: neutral territory, private conference room, and even a court reporter to document the exchange. It was a power move, and I appreciated every detail of it. Susan's boss, Jeff Davis, walked in first, his usual smug confidence dimmed by the uncertainty of the situation. Behind him were two senior executives from the company's legal team, clearly briefed but visibly uncomfortable. Ted wasted no time. "Thank you for meeting with us. I'll cut to the chase. My client, Mr. Matthews, has gathered substantial evidence that implicates Mr. Davis and other parties in activities that not only violate professional ethics, but also open the company to legal liabilities." He slid a folder across the table. Inside were carefully curated screenshots, video stills, and excerpts from conversations Susan had with Jeff and others. The atmosphere in the room shifted immediately. Jeff's face turned pale as he flipped through the evidence, his fingers trembling slightly. One of the lawyers tried to keep a poker face, but failed miserably. "This is absurd," Jeff sputtered, pushing the folder back toward Ted. "You're just trying to extort us." Ted leaned back in his chair, calm and composed. "No one here is interested in extortion, Mr. Davis. We're offering you an opportunity to resolve this quietly. If this goes public, if it reaches HR, the board, or worse, the media, it won't just be my client's reputation on the line. It'll be yours. And the company's." The room went silent. It was the kind of silence that comes when people realize they're cornered with no way out. One of the lawyers cleared her throat and asked, "What exactly is your client seeking?" "Compensation for emotional damages, lost time, and the cost of legal proceedings," Ted replied smoothly. "A private settlement, along with assurances that Mr. Davis will not retaliate against my client or anyone involved." "And the amount?" Ted smiled. "I think you'll find it reasonable." He slid another piece of paper across the table, a proposed settlement agreement with a figure that was large enough to sting but small enough to avoid a protracted legal battle. The lawyers exchanged uneasy glances before nodding. "We'll review this with the board and get back to you within 48 hours. Jeff opened his mouth to argue, but one of the lawyers silenced him with a look. As they gathered their papers and left the room, Ted turned to me with a smirk. "Step 1. Complete." I didn't say much on the drive home, but for the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe. We had taken the first step in holding them accountable. And while I knew there was still more to come, this small victory felt monumental. The settlement came through faster than expected. Within a week, Susan's employers agreed to pay the amount Ted had proposed. Along with the money came a carefully worded agreement. No retaliation, no public statements, and a quiet departure for Jeff Davis. Ted called it a win, and for once, I didn't feel like the world was stacked against me. With that chapter handled, it was time to face the divorce. Susan, of course, didn't go down without a fight. She demanded the house, spousal support, and a sizable share of my assets. Her audacity was staggering, but I shouldn't have been surprised. When we sat down for mediation, Susan tried to wear her guilt like a badge of pity. "I made mistakes," she said, voice trembling, as if we were negotiating a bad breakup and not her betrayal. "But we were both unhappy. Can't we just move forward and settle this fairly?" Fairly? I nearly laughed out loud. But Ted, ever the professional, kept me grounded. "Fairness is exactly what we're aiming for," Ted said, sliding a thick folder of evidence across the table. "However, considering Mrs. Matthews' actions, we believe a more equitable division is warranted." Susan's lawyer glanced at the folder, and I could see the discomfort on his face. The weight of our evidence, and the potential fallout if it came to light, left them with little room to negotiate. In the end, the agreement was clear. Susan would get the house and the car, but I retained full control of my finances. No spousal support, no ongoing payments. We split the remaining assets, and since we didn't have children, the matter of custody was mercifully off the table. The day the divorce was finalized felt surreal. Standing outside the courthouse, papers in hand, I felt a mix of emotions: relief, sadness, and an odd sense of accomplishment. I had survived something that could have destroyed me. Susan tried to speak to me one last time as we left the building. "I didn't want it to end like this," she said softly, her eyes glassy with tears. Neither did I thought. But I didn't say it. Instead, I just nodded, turned away, and walked to my car. Driving home that day, I realized something. The Susan I had married no longer existed. The person who had laughed with me, dreamed with me, and built a life with me was gone, replaced by someone I no longer recognized. The divorce was over, but the process of healing was just beginning. The first few months after the divorce felt like living in a fog. The house was quiet, almost too quiet, and the absence of Susan's presence was both a relief and a constant reminder of what had happened. Every corner of the home felt like it carried echoes of our past, memories I didn't want but couldn't ignore. At first, I wallowed. Nights were spent drowning in old photos, nursing a drink, and replaying moments in my head. I kept asking myself the same questions. How did it get to this point? Could I have done something differently? But eventually, I realized those questions didn't matter anymore. What mattered was what I did next. I started small, cleaning the house, rearranging furniture, getting rid of anything that reminded me of her. It was cathartic, like I was reclaiming the space for myself. I donated the wedding photos, boxed up her remaining belongings, and even painted the living room a new color. From there, I moved on to myself. I joined a gym, partly out of spite and partly because I needed something to focus on. At first, it was hard. Every workout felt like a battle with my own lethargy. But as the weeks went by, I started to see changes. My energy improved, my confidence grew, and I began to feel like someone new. I also invested in my appearance. New clothes, a fresh haircut, and even a skincare routine, things I hadn't bothered with before. It wasn't about impressing anyone. It was about feeling good in my own skin. But the real transformation wasn't just physical. It was emotional. Therapy became a weekly ritual, a safe space to unpack everything I'd been through. My therapist, a kind but no-nonsense woman named Dr. Patel, helped me see that the betrayal wasn't a reflection of my worth. She made her choices, Dr. Patel said one session. But you have the power to choose what happens next. Don't let her actions define you. Slowly but surely, I started to rebuild my sense of self. I took up hobbies I'd abandoned, playing guitar, hiking, even trying my hand at cooking. My days began to feel full again, not with the chaos of my old life, but with a new sense of purpose. And for the first time in years, I felt free. Free to make decisions for myself. Free to rediscover who I was, and free to envision a future that didn't include her. It happened on a crisp autumn afternoon, years after the divorce. I was at a local cafe, enjoying a rare moment of peace, when I saw her. Susan walked in, arm in arm with a man I didn't recognize. Her fiancé, I assumed. She hadn't changed much. Still beautiful, still carrying herself with that air of charm that had once captivated me. But there was something different, something guarded in her expression, a slight tension that hadn't been there before. I thought about leaving. Avoiding her entirely would have been easy, but something stopped me. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was the part of me that wanted closure. Either way, I stayed, sipping my coffee and watching the scene unfold. She spotted me almost immediately. Her face froze for a split second before she plastered on a polite smile. She leaned over to her fiancé, said something, and then walked over to my table. "Hi," she said hesitantly, her voice softer than I remembered. "Hi, Susan," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. She glanced at the empty chair across from me, silently asking if she could sit. I nodded, and she lowered herself into the seat. "I didn't expect to see you here," she began, her hands fidgeting with the strap of her purse. "Neither did I," I said simply. For a moment there was silence. It wasn't awkward, exactly, but it was heavy, laden with the weight of everything unsaid between us. "How have you been?" she asked finally. "Better," I answered honestly. "And you?" She hesitated, then nodded. "I'm good. Things are different now." I glanced over at her fiancé, who was busy ordering at the counter. "So, you're engaged?" Her eyes followed mine, and she smiled faintly. "Yes. His name is Mark. He's a good man." I didn't miss the way her voice faltered slightly, as if she were convincing herself as much as she was telling me. Reaching into my bag, I pulled out a small envelope and slid it across the table toward her. I wasn't sure if I'd ever see you again, but since you're here, I thought you might want this. She picked up the envelope, her brow furrowing in confusion. What is it? Copies of everything from the divorce, I said. The recordings, the messages, the files. I kept a set, but I don't need them anymore. You should have them. Do with them what you want. Her hands shook slightly as she held the envelope, and I saw a flicker of fear in her eyes. Why are you giving me this? Because I've moved on, I replied. And maybe it's time you faced all of it too. Your fiancé seems like a decent guy. He deserves to know the truth, don't you think? Her lips parted as if to argue, but no words came. Instead, she nodded slowly, tucking the envelope into her bag. I stood up, grabbing my coffee. Take care, Susan. She didn't say anything as I walked away, but I could feel her eyes on me, heavy with emotions I didn't care to interpret. As I stepped outside and felt the crisp air on my face, I realized something profound. I was no longer angry, no longer bitter. This was closure, not the dramatic kind I'd envisioned, but the quiet, understated kind that let me walk away with my head held high. Walking away from that cafe, I felt lighter than I had in years. There was no satisfaction in seeing Susan's reaction, no triumph in watching her squirm. Instead, there was a quiet relief, a sense that I had finally put the past to rest. The drive home was peaceful. The usual torrent of thoughts that had once accompanied memories of Susan was absent. For the first time, I wasn't replaying old arguments or questioning the choices that led us here. Instead, I was simply present, enjoying the crisp fall air and the hum of the road beneath my tires. That night, I sat on the porch with a glass of wine, staring at the stars. It felt symbolic in a way, like I was saying goodbye to a chapter of my life that had defined me for far too long. Reflecting on everything, I realized that the pain I had carried for so long wasn't just about Susan's betrayal. It was about my own sense of failure, my fear that I hadn't been enough, that I hadn't seen the warning signs, that I had somehow deserved what happened. But now, I could see it differently. Her actions weren't a reflection of my worth. They were a reflection of her choices, her flaws, her inability to value what we had. That wasn't on me. Over the next few weeks, I noticed a shift in how I view my life. The bitterness that had once colored so many of my thoughts was gone, replaced by a quiet determination to focus on what truly mattered. I reconnected with old friends, started volunteering at a local community center, and even began dating again, though cautiously and with no expectations. It wasn't about finding someone new to fill the void. It was about embracing life on my own terms. One evening, while sorting through some old boxes, I came across a journal I had kept during the early days of my marriage. Flipping through the pages, I saw the hopes and dreams I had written down, so full of optimism and love. I smiled as I read the words. I wasn't that person anymore, but that was okay. Life had changed me, hardened me in some ways, but softened me in others. I had grown, learned, and come out stronger. By the time I closed the journal and tucked it away, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. The past was behind me, and for the first time, I wasn't running from it or clinging to it. I was ready to move forward. Looking back on everything, it's hard to believe how much has changed. The man I was when this all began feels like a stranger now, naive, trusting, and maybe too blind to see what was right in front of him. But that's life, isn't it? You learn, you grow, and you move on. If there's one thing I've learned from this journey, it's that betrayal doesn't define you. It hurts, yes. It cuts deep and leaves scars that might never fully fade. But it's also an opportunity, a chance to rebuild, to rediscover who you are, and to create a better version of yourself. To anyone who's been in my shoes, let me tell you this: you're stronger than you think. The pain might feel unbearable now, but it will pass. And when it does, you'll see things more clearly. You'll understand that someone else's actions don't diminish your value. Take it one step at a time. Focus on the things you can control: your health, your happiness, your future. Don't let the actions of others hold you hostage. As for relationships, don't lose faith in them. Yes, I was betrayed, But that doesn't mean love isn't worth it. It just means that next time I'll be wiser, more cautious, and more discerning about who I let into my life. And to those who might be tempted to betray someone they claim to love, think twice. The pain you cause ripples far beyond what you can imagine. Trust is fragile, and once it's broken, it's almost impossible to mend. I hope my story serves as a cautionary tale, but also as a source of hope. Betrayal is not the end. It's a new beginning, a chance to rebuild stronger, wiser, and more resilient than before. Thank you for listening, and remember, your worth is not defined by someone else's mistakes. Keep moving forward. As I sat on my porch one evening, the sun dipping below the horizon, I found myself reflecting on how far I'd come. The bitterness, the anger, even the heartbreak. All of it felt distant now, like a storm that had finally passed. Life is a way of surprising you. When I was in the thick of it, I couldn't imagine ever feeling whole again. The betrayal was so raw, so consuming, that it felt like it would swallow me whole. But time, as they say, has a way of healing even the deepest wounds. In hindsight, the divorce wasn't just the end of my marriage. It was the beginning of a transformation. It forced me to look inward, to confront my own flaws and rediscover the parts of myself I had lost in the chaos. I thought about Susan often, not with anger or regret, but with a kind of quiet understanding. She had made her choices, and I had made mine. Our paths had diverged, and that was okay. Life had given me the chance to rebuild, and I had taken it. Now, my days were filled with things that brought me joy. Hiking through trails I'd never explored, learning to cook meals that were more than just sustenance, even sitting down to write about my experiences in a way that might help others. Looking back, I realized the most important thing I'd gained wasn't closure or even justice. It was clarity. Clarity about who I was, what I wanted, and what I deserved. We all face storms in life, and betrayal is one of the harshest. But if my journey has taught me anything, it's that the storm doesn't last forever. And when it clears, the world feels brighter, more vibrant, and full of possibilities. As the first stars appeared in the night sky, I raised a glass to the man I had become. Not perfect, not without scars, but stronger, wiser, and ready for whatever came next. Life after betrayal isn't about returning to who you were. It's about becoming someone new. I learned that lesson slowly, piece by piece, as I rebuilt my life. At first, it felt strange. The routines I once clung to were gone, replaced by new habits and hobbies that I hadn't imagined for myself. The man I saw in the mirror looked different, not just physically, though the gym had certainly helped, but emotionally. There was a quiet strength there, a resilience I hadn't noticed before. Work became a welcome distraction, but also an unexpected source of fulfillment. I poured myself into projects I'd once ignored, rediscovered passions I'd shelved, and even earned a promotion. It felt good to excel on my own terms, to know my success wasn't tied to anyone else. Socially, I opened myself up again. I reconnected with old friends, people I'd lost touch with during my marriage. They welcomed me back without hesitation, and their support reminded me that I wasn't alone. New friendships formed, too. Some through work, others through hobbies like hiking and volunteering. Dating was another hurdle, one I approached cautiously. At first, it felt daunting. How could I trust someone again? How could I open myself up after what I'd been through? But as time passed, I realized not everyone was like Susan. There were good people out there, people who valued honesty and loyalty. I didn't rush into anything serious. Instead, I took my time, enjoying the process of getting to know new people without the pressure of finding the one. It wasn't about replacing Susan or filling a void. It was about discovering what I wanted in a partner and what I was willing to give in return. Through it all, I focused on gratitude. Gratitude for the lessons I'd learned, for the people who stood by me, and for the opportunities I'd been given to start over. Life didn't feel perfect, but it felt real, messy, unpredictable, and full of possibilities. If there's one thing betrayal taught me, it's that life goes on. It might not look the way you imagined, but that's the beauty of it. You adapt, you grow, and eventually, you find a version of happiness that's uniquely your own. It was a quiet Sunday morning when I realized just how far I'd come. The sunlight poured into my new apartment, casting a warm glow on the walls. I had moved a few months earlier, leaving behind the house I once shared with Susan. It wasn't an easy decision, but it was the right one. The house had too many memories, too many echoes of a life I no longer wanted to revisit. This new place felt different. It was smaller but cozier, filled only with things I truly loved. Every piece of furniture, every photo on the wall, reflected who I was now, not who I had been. It felt like a fresh start, and for the first time in years, I felt at home. The day-to-day had settled into a rhythm that felt natural. I'd wake up early, brew a cup of coffee, and take a few moments to just breathe. Sometimes I'd go for a run or sit on the balcony with a book. Other times, I'd jot down thoughts in a journal, something I'd started during therapy and had kept up ever since. Work was thriving, friendships were flourishing, and while I wasn't actively seeking a new relationship, I was open to the idea. I'd gone on a few dates, nothing serious, just casual dinners and long conversations. It was refreshing to connect with new people, to see the world through fresh eyes. One evening, while attending a local charity event, I met someone. Her name was Emma, and she wasn't anything like Susan. She was warm, down to earth, with a laugh that felt like sunlight breaking through clouds. We started talking about the event, then about life, and before I knew it, hours had passed. There was no rush, no pressure. It wasn't about filling a void or proving something to myself. It was about enjoying the moment. Emma and I exchanged numbers, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a spark of excitement. As I walked home that night, I realized that this was what a new chapter looked like. It wasn't about erasing the past or pretending it never happened. It was about embracing where I was now, with all the scars, lessons, and growth that had brought me here. Life wasn't perfect, but it was mine, and that was enough. My first few conversations with Emma were like a breath of fresh air. She wasn't like anyone I had met before, not just because of her warmth, but because of her authenticity. She didn't shy away from deep topics or pretend to be perfect. She was real, and I found myself drawn to that. Our first date was simple. A walk through the park, followed by coffee at a quiet little cafe. There was no pressure, no grand gestures. Just two people sharing stories, laughing, and enjoying each other's company. I told her about my love for hiking, my newfound cooking skills, and the way I had rediscovered myself after the divorce. She listened, not with pity, but with genuine curiosity. And when it was her turn to share, she opened up about her own journey. Emma had been through her own heartbreak, and like me, she had used it as an opportunity to grow. As the weeks turned into months, something unexpected happened. I began to trust again. Slowly, cautiously, but surely. It wasn't just Emma's kindness that made this possible. It was the work I had done on myself. I had built a foundation strong enough to support new connections. And for the first time in years, I felt ready to let someone in. Emma and I didn't rush into anything. We took our time, learning about each other's quirks, dreams, and fears. She wasn't afraid to call me out when I slipped into old patterns of doubt or hesitancy, and I appreciated that. She challenged me in the best ways, helping me grow even further. There was a moment, one evening as we watched the sunset from a hilltop, when I realized how different this felt. It wasn't the rush of infatuation or the idealized romance I had once believed in. It was steady, grounded, and real. I don't know where this is going. I told her honestly, my voice low but steady. But I like where we are now. She smiled, her eyes meeting mine with a warmth that made me feel seen. Me too. Let's just enjoy it and see what happens. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to feel hopeful, not just about Emma, but about life itself. The pain of the past hadn't disappeared, but it no longer defined me. Instead, it had shaped me into someone who could face the future with open eyes and an open heart. The thing about moving forward is that it doesn't happen all at once. It's a process, a series of small moments that add up over time. And as I stood on that hilltop with Emma, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I realized I was finally ready to embrace what lay ahead. Life didn't magically become perfect after that. There were still challenges, work stress, moments of doubt, and the occasional pang of sadness when an old memory surfaced. But those moments no longer felt overwhelming. They were just reminders of where I had been and how far I had come. Emma became an important part of my life, but she wasn't the center of it. And that's what made it work. I had learned that my happiness couldn't hinge on someone else, that it had to come from within. We started building a life together slowly. Weekend hikes, lazy Sundays cooking breakfast, and late-night talks about everything and nothing. She brought out the best in me, and I like to think I did the same for her. As the months turned into a year, I began to see a future I hadn't imagined before. Not the one I had planned with Susan, but a new one shaped by the person I had become. I thought about the man I was when all of this started, the one who felt broken and betrayed, unsure if he could ever trust again. That man seemed like a distant memory now. The scars were still there, but they no longer defined me. One evening, as Emma and I sat on the porch of my apartment, watching the city lights twinkle in the distance, she turned to me and asked, "Do you ever think about the past?" I took a deep breath considering her question. Sometimes, I admitted, but not in the same way. It doesn't hurt like it used to. If anything, it reminds me of how much I've grown. She smiled, reaching for my hand. I think that's what makes you who you are. You didn't let it break you. In that moment, I realized she was right. The betrayal, the heartbreak, the rebuilding, it had all been part of a journey, one that had led me to where I was now. The future wasn't set in stone, but that didn't scare me anymore. I had rewritten my story once, and I knew I could do it again if I needed to. And as I looked at Emma, her hand in mine, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Peace.